Okay, this is the audio lecture for Chapter 2, The Matrix of Race, The Shaping of a Nation, The Social Construction of Race in America. All right, so again, let's start off with the learning objectives for Chapter 2, which are to explore how recent events have affected how we experience race, to describe the Americas before Columbus, to examine the patterns of Spanish, French, and British colonialism in the Americas, and to evaluate the intersections of race, identities, institutions, and resistance. Alrighty, so first up with shaping a nation, right? There are changing demographics. So the United States has historically been defined by race and ethnic diversity throughout time. Close to 60 million immigrants have arrived in the U.S. just over the past 50 years. So the U.S. population is projected to grow in the next 40 years, largely from immigrant populations who have higher fertility rates than the general population. So the demographic changes will have a significant impact on most of our institutions. So we're also living in the influence of a changing world. 9/11 resulted in the War on Terror, which has spiraled into this never-ending war, waged without congressional approval all over the world. But many of these wars, especially Afghanistan and Iraq, center around notions of the other, something we'll discuss when it comes to racializing people. So during the last few decades, ethnic violence has erupted into genocide, which is defined as the large-scale systematic destruction of a people or nation. And racial violence is a feature of genocide, and is a violence that pits one racial group against another. This occurs all over the world. In this country, protests and uprisings have resulted in various times in U.S. history, almost always the result of some sort of racial violence or brutality, such as police brutality. And this reveals anxieties and frustrations about race in the United States that we don't like to talk about. So, of course, since we don't like to talk about them, we don't like to deal with them either, until they boil over into the streets. And even then, rarely is the discussion about systematic change. It is typically a focus on property destruction. So moving on to revising the experience of work, gender, and race. So again, looking at those intersections. So when it comes to who makes up the companies that have the most power and control in American society, women make up over 4% of Fortune 500 firm CEOs, while Asians, Hispanics, and Blacks account for slightly more than 1% of Fortune 500 CEOs. So this shows that while there has been equality in some aspects of work, there's clearly still an issue with getting to the top. Right? That still seems to be a realm very strongly controlled by whiteness and by maleness. So the glass ceiling is the idea that women often face barriers moving into leadership positions in career fields. And this is mostly because of societal ideas of gender. Those ideas say that men are natural leaders and women are not. So as a result of this, women of all social groups have lost ground over the last few years. And this is also due to what's called the triple glass ceiling, right? Because, one's not enough. So the triple glass ceiling is where work discrimination is based on race, class, and gender. And we can see the results of this in annual earnings and wage disparities. So wage disparities impact all women, but are greatest among Hispanic, Latina, African American, Native Hawaiian, and other indigenous women's groups. So the highest gender gap that we have when it comes to the gender gap in pay is between white non-Hispanic women and men. And while education does improve earnings of all women, racial and gender differences still remain, even when education is taken into account. So when it comes to the United States, it is more diverse than ever. But many realities continue to be structured by race in this country, despite those changes. So one example that is discussed in the text is school segregation. So white students are only slightly less likely than previous generations to attend nearly all white primary and secondary schools. And minority students are more likely to attend nearly all minority schools. So also, as middle-class women and women of color have reversed the achievement gap for college completion and graduate school admission, among lower-class women and men of color, these gaps have actually become more entrenched. So it's important to look at these things from multiple perspectives and see how, even though the structural barriers that caused segregated schooling to begin have been erased at this point, it's still happening. So the media is a very important factor, especially in our modern society. The evolving narrative of popular culture affects the way that we then interpret and understand race, right? Especially when we talk about Hollywood. Racial representations over time have often been white actors portraying actors of color in demeaning, humiliating, stereotypical, discriminatory ways. I mean, even till the present day, there's still many roles that, while they might be slightly more controversial than they were in the past, have whites acting as if they're ethnic or racial minorities in ways that obviously should be portrayed by characters that are actually of color. So anyway, when it comes to race, class, and gender, those issues still prevail even in fictional universes. So we see that when it comes to racial representation in film, as I have the graphic over here on the side, we see that the breakdown is overwhelmingly white, right? And so what does that mean? It means that most of the stories we see come from the perspective of white people. Most of the characters that we, care about, have empathy for, end up, wanting to achieve something, they're white and predominantly white male, right? So when you talk about this, how does that then affect what we see in society? Because if you can't see something, it's hard to believe something exists. So it's almost like this erasure of any minorities. And again, the idea that even when there are roles that are available for minority actors and they go to white actors, right? That's another problematic issue. So again, even when you talk about all the kind of like fandom universes, right? You have let's say like the Harry Potter universe or any of those kind of universes, you see that even though there are sometimes a couple characters of color, they tend to be ancillary, they tend to be sidekicks, they do not tend to be the main narrative character who tends to be a white male, right? So this of course affects how we even understand, what stories are important to be told and, whose stories we care about. So there's another impact too of social media and technology, right? As about half of all Americans now use social networks. And research shows that even online, our experiences are structured by race, class, and gender. So rather than challenging the status quo as social media is supposed to do, the online world ultimately reproduces the inequality we see in the larger society. So there's so many colonial myths, and these things have to be unpacked because unless we understand the true history of the culture, we can't actually, go from there to build a better understanding of how these things have been created, right? So as a nation, we rely upon certain stories to bind us together. And the founding of our country is one of those stories. So when it comes to stories about the earliest Americans, we hear this idea that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And this created a myth where Columbus is portrayed as some sort of scientific genius who discovered America. And it served as a creation myth for the United States. But of course, it was not actually a discovery. He didn't discover some empty swath of land. In reality, it was an invasion, right? The true history of Columbus is disturbing and involves his enthusiasm for mutilation, right? As he loved to use it as a punishment, like when he cut off a woman's tongue for mentioning that he had humble beginnings, or when he nailed a boy's hand to the wall because he was fishing. So and that was like him mutilating the Spanish, right? But he saved his worst for the indigenous population. For instance, one of his journals talked about his experience raping a woman who fought and scratched him, so he savagely whipped her with a rope. All sorts of crap like that, including selling girls as young as 9 into sex slavery. So yeah, not a dude we should be celebrating. But history is like a memory. It can be distorted. And this choice of, creating a hero out of Columbus really shows what is it we want to focus on, what is it we don't. Why are we celebrating colonization? So note, Columbus didn't find some empty swath of land. He found a place with a rich history, right? Hundreds of years before Columbus showed up, North America was already home to millions of people with distinct population groups, tribes, linguistic, and cultural systems. These original Americans were highly developed, unlike, our history tells us. So colonialism is very important to understand, right? So colonization creates a hierarchical relationship where groups are defined culturally, ethnically, or racially. So think of a hierarchy like a ladder, right? The people that have the most value are at the top. The people that have the least are at the bottom. So there's an interest that colonization serves. It serves to guarantee the political, social, and economic interests of the dominant group. And often, religious ideology was also used to justify wars of aggression, exploitation, enslavement, and colonization. So Vikings were really kind of the advent of this, at least in the Americas. So European colonization in the Americas actually began in the 10th and 11th century when Viking sailors explored what's currently Canada and, just made their way a little bit down into what is now the United States. But it's really when Spanish colonialism took hold that we started to see the kind of shaping of the Americas as they are today. So Columbus lands in Cuba, and though numerous Native American groups occupied the land, Columbus deemed it empty land. So this was, clearly it wasn't just an eyesight issue. He just basically didn't even see their worth as living there. Also, on his second voyage back to Cuba, that he had actually named something else at the time, Columbus captured 1,500 indigenous people and selected 550 of the, quote, best males and females, end quote, to be presented to the Spanish Queen Isabella and sold in the slave markets of Seville, Spain. So it was an economic system as much as a racial system by design, right? Controlling people, controlling their lands, controlling their labor, using them as a means to extract resources and wealth, right? So it's interesting how we can see in an intersectional analysis how racial categories and hierarchies are really closely connected to social class and economic interests. Another important impact of colonialism was the slave system. So the first slaves in the American colonies were the indigenous. Ultimately, labor shortages, fueled by continuous warfare, disease, and sheer overwork, decimated native populations, who were literally worked to death. And remember, they had no immunity to European diseases, which wiped out many lives. So an estimated 75,000 to 90,000 African slaves were sent to Spanish America by 1600. This, of course, would more than triple by the end of the 17th century. So meanwhile, you have the French colonialism. So New France was founded in 1534 Quebec by Jacques Cartier, and this later allowed France to claim land that would later become Canada. The primary goal was the Christianization of the natives. Among merchants, the French colonial expansion was a business venture, and these merchants put profit ahead of development. The official goal was Christianization, but not until the first settlements were established and the fur trade provided the motivation to integrate the indigenous population into French colonial policy. Meaning before that, they didn't really care about the indigenous, but then all of a sudden when there's an economic reason to care, that's when they created this kind of understanding. So French colonizers also enslaved Native Americans before turning to African slaves. The French found that there were not enough enslaved indigenous people surviving to provide labor, so close to 4,000 Africans were forcibly brought for labor, and they joined other groups that were already enslaved by the French. The Colonial Ordinance of 1685, also known as the Black Codes, legislated life, death, purchase, marriage, religion, and treatment of slaves by their masters. It required that all slaves be baptized and educated in the Catholic faith. It said that slaves could not own property or have any legal recourse. It also said when they could marry, where they could be buried, what punishments could be meted out, and under what conditions they could be freed. The code prohibited whites as well as free blacks from having sex with slaves, but there was a loophole where children were considered legitimate and free. So moving on from French colonialism to British colonialism, pretty similar. British colonization is said to have started with the Mayflower of 1620. And they also set out to Christianize native populations. So they were sharing the European rationalization for imperial expansion by declaring that the indigenous people were barbaric or savage. Did they really think this? It's unclear. but it is certainly an ideology that helps them commit horrific injustices, and that's why it's referred to as rationalization. Because you can say you believe in rights, but exempt the natives if you act as if they're not people. So when it comes to slavery in the British colonies, they also tried to enslave the natives and found that they were unable to complete the necessary labor. So the first group of non-natives showed up to be slaves. So the first slaves in New England were poor and white. They began arriving in the early 1600s. So the English slave masters looked upon the Irish, who were those first slaves, as lazy and fit to be enslaved. Upward of 50,000 people, mostly women and children, were deported to the Americas, right? Irish. Harsh treatment led frequently to collaborative rebellions between the Irish and blacks. And so, of course, this caused problems for the planter class, as we'll discuss. So the first black people entered Jamestown in 1619 as indentured servants, but by 1661, they were legislated into slavery. So in the year after, a law would link slavery to maternity by declaring all children would be free or slave according to the status of their mother. When the English founded Carolina, they made a lot of money selling Native American slaves. What ultimately came from this was a racial hierarchy where European landowners dominated both Native and African slaves. So slave rebellions represented a continual and persistent source of stress and strain for the white planter class. The first significant rebellion happened in Virginia and included both white indentured servants and slaves. So their goal was to overthrow their white masters. And the result of this were laws, where slave masters tried to create more distinctions between these groups. Now, why would they do that? Well, it's that classic divide and conquer. If you don't want them to come together as one, find a wedge to drive between them, so they no longer see their common interests. So the Bacon's Rebellion was the most significant challenge to class structure. The revolt included Black, Irish, Scots, and English bondservants. They all came together, seeing the planter elite as their shared enemy. So the elite response created new identities of color and race to take the place, in a sense, of the class and status from before that. An important takeaway was the size and impact of the rebellion, which included over 6,000 European Americans and 2,000 African Americans who marched to take over the military arsenal at West Point and forced the governor to flee. The rebellion also shut down all tobacco production for the next 14 months, which was a huge cash crop at the time. The rebellion threatened the heart of British colonial system by challenging their power and their control over labor. They responded by solidifying slavery into a racial caste system. All right, moving on to borderlands and frontiers. Most of the land in the Americas was formerly under the control of various Native American federations. So Europeans defined those lands as frontiers or borderlands. Obviously, this fails to appreciate the reality of these spaces. The Europeans told themselves they were protecting the land. Since they saw themselves as strong protectors, they placed the lands into something they called a protectorate. So the contested spaces between the Spanish, French, and English colonies provided the illusion of Native American national sovereignty, but this also provided an outlet and a space where Europeans could wage imperialistic wars against each other. So built up into this idea, or just to understand how this worked, is the Turner thesis of 1893. So it's famous because it provided the dominant narrative, or what the textbook calls stock story, of the United States. So the thesis said that American identity is forged in the American frontier experience. This supposed American identity included democratic governance, rugged individualism, wherever I had heard that one recently, innovative thinking, and egalitarian viewpoints. So according to Turner, the American frontier provided the encouragement and the space to unleash the progressive spirit of freedom. See, that must be pretty ironic to the people whose land it actually was, right? It took 70 years before the counter-narratives were ever even heard. And those counter-narratives rejected the idea of the frontier and all the presumptions that come with it. It wasn't empty land waiting to be settled and tamed. These were lands controlled by nations and protected by treaties. The real history involves murder, lies, corruption, broken promises, and broken treaties by the European colonizers. So when we examine and investigate institutions and their narratives, we see how the earliest colonial roots created the matrix of race, and that race influences other major identities, like gender, sexuality, ethnicity, and class. And when you look at the relationship between those identities and the dominant social institutions throughout American history, just as identities like race have myths that help them become socially accepted and justified, powerful narratives also form the basis of our social institutions. For example, the notion of meritocracy that says we can all be successful if we just work hard. And the institution of education builds off this and has a social narrative that education is the great equalizer, meaning that education can equalize life opportunities and chances regardless of social and economic levels. The problem is this isn't exactly true. It obscures how inequalities still shape our lives, and especially, even when you control for level of education, right, you still see unequal outcomes. Plus, as we'll discuss later, education is not equal in this country. Resources are allocated to schools differently. Children are segregated in neighborhoods, which translates to segregation in education. And the type of neighborhood someone lives in affects the quality of education they receive. Plus, you can get a doctorate, but that doesn't mean society is magically non-racist after. So we will explore later how education has been constructed from the start to be separate and unequal. We also need to examine intersecting identities to see the fuller picture of the realities within the matrix as related to each institution. This shows us that life is different depending on where you fall in that matrix. So another important consideration is that people may experience the same position in the matrix differently. Life is complex. There are no monolithic groups where each person has experienced the same thing in the exact same way. Also, institutions have a lot of power in society, as most of our daily lives are governed by them. But this is not equally true for groups that we identify like race, class, or gender. Institutions give different rewards to different groups. So our lives become the product and the result of the arrangement of power and hierarchy in our social institutions. If we can see this, then we can see how the institutions have come to wield this power, and how history and culture affects who's at the top of the hierarchy and who's at the bottom, and why it always seems to stay that way.